Arts Alive SDSU is dedicated to providing opportunities to promote creative research and interdisciplinary connection, which is exactly what this Discovery series is about. It's looking at familiar topics from unfamiliar, perhaps new perspectives. So we're so excited to have these conversations, introduce you to new ways of thinking about these familiar topics. And then I'd also like to thank all of our students for being here, for being open to this conversation and participating. We are starting an Arts Alive certificate, which goes on your co-curricular transcript. So all students who attend, please make sure that you do register so we can track your attendance. For all students who participate, not only do you get the certificate for attending our programming, but for graduating seniors, you'll get an cool honor cord to go with your graduation regalia. If you're interested, I have a flyer over here as well, or you can talk to me after the panel. Our other Discovery Series events will be taking place over the next 5 or 6 weeks. We have some really exciting panels coming up. You can learn about those and our other programming on our Arts Alive SDSU website. It's artsalive.sdsu.edu. I'd also like to thank One SDSU for their support of this event, of the Discovery Series as a whole, and thank all of our panelists for being here today. As a final note, this panel is in connection with a concert that will be taking place this Sunday at 4 p.m. At Patrick Henry High School's Performing Arts Center. So if you do need information about that, there are plenty of people around the room that you can ask about it. And we are looking forward to seeing everyone at that concert and hearing what all of our esteemed panelists have to say today. And sorry, I forgot to mention someone else very important. I'm standing in today for our Kahlo, who is the chair of Arts Alive SDSU. She couldn't make it today, but I am so thankful for her leadership, and we appreciate everyone being here with Arts Alive SDSU.
I'll take it a little bit from here, and before we let our panelists introduce themselves and speak a little bit about themselves, I thought it would be great if Dr. Kim and I gave a little overview of the project. For me personally, this is, I believe, my 4th or 5th Discovery Series in the last 2 or 3 years event. And it's really only our 2nd that wasn't primarily Zoom. Or one of our projects was pre-record the music and then shoot video with it, put it online, a YouTube live broadcast. So this Sunday is so exciting for us, and to have our composer here with us. I'm so excited for the conversation, but really the genesis of the project, Dr. Kim, would you be willing to just kind of say, because you were the one that emailed the faculty and said, I have this idea. Would you expand on it a little bit?
Sure. So it all began when I learned that the San Diego Opera is going to do a world premiere of Dr. Gabriela Lena Frank's new opera. And I wondered if she is coming for the showcase. And then she did, and then I was at the showcase, and I just asked her if she would be interested in coming to meet our students at SDSU, because she's here. We don't have to pay for her travel. She doesn't have to do any extra travel. And she's world-renowned composer. So I just didn't want to miss the opportunity. And then she was so graceful to say, of course. So that made my year, basically. And then from there, I didn't want to have her just for one occasion, so I tried to build more and more idea, and then the big part was completed when Arts Alive joined. So I thank for Arts Alive and One SDSU for great support. And so the project is that we'll talk about her opera, because that's why we could be here to begin with. And that's a fascinating thing. The opera, we will hear about the opera soon, but it's about Frida and Diego, and it could cover lots of different intersecting subjects that we are going to talk about. But in addition to that, that's one of the newer projects that she's doing. So I wanted to present her earlier pieces with a bigger ensembles. So, and then that came up with her 2 earliest orchestra pieces. that are published. So that are Elegía Andina and also 3 Latin American dances. So the orchestra, conducted by the director, and they will perform the Elegía Andina, and the band will perform the 3 Latin American dances. But it involves a little more work because that's originally for orchestra. But we wanted to have more people join this group, and then we also have wonderful wind symphony as well as the orchestra. So I volunteered to arrange it for to score for wind symphony. So you will hear the premiere of new version in addition to the actual world premiere of her opera. So this is going to be a great week for San Diego. And I'm really grateful for everyone who joined to talk about things more deeply. So, thanks.
Yeah. So, I think at this point, let's introduce everybody. I deserve the least amount of introduction right now as the band director. And I'm so excited because originally, when we knew you were coming to town and we started exploring your literature, I reached out to John Lynch in Kansas because you had premiered a work with him. And I said, John, what is this piece? He said, it's wonderful. And then he explained the instrumentation. I went, that might be a bit much for my group right now. But then I got acquainted through TechSoup with 3 Latin American dances, and I thought this is going to be a great band piece. And it really has worked quite well. And we hope so much someday that you like the recording we're able to share with you. And I just shared with her, we're going to take this piece on tour. We're going to take this to a band festival where there will be 30 high schools, and 30 of the best high schools in the state of California get to listen to it. I'm hoping to get some exposure for it. I think it could really explode in the band world. It would be a nice addition to our repertoire. So these projects for me, for Arts Alive, are just, they get to add so much more of my field to what we do. So very, very exciting stuff. So as a panelist, I feel I'm more of someone to listen. I really feel that with our experts. So I'm the band director. Let's just go down the line, and could you all maybe introduce yourselves, give us a little bit of history, and then we'll start our conversation.
Yeah, sure. Well, first I have to apologize for the mask because we are in the thick of rehearsals right now. We had a couple of COVID cases with the singers. Everybody got very careful. So we're daily testing, and I'm supposed to wear this as much as I can. I'm a composer, and I trained initially as a pianist. My mom's from South America, in a beautiful small Andean nation of Peru. And my father's a nice Jewish boy from the Bronx. And they met because he was in the Peace Corps in the 60s. And so my mom left this small fishing village to come to Berkeley in the 60s, just as the civil rights initiatives were kicking off for Latinos and African Americans. And I grew up in the 70s at a really magical time when Berkeley was very affordable. My father was a grad student, could buy a house here. And everything's like completely transformed in the state. We were scholastically high achievers, my brother and myself, and the parents that we had no choice about that. And I started training in classical music pretty early. My teacher was a refugee from South Africa who taught me African songs alongside like Bach and Haydn and all the standard stuff. This was a very Berkeley kind of upbringing. Most of my girlhood friends were mixed race, the way that I was, because of multiple languages. And I love música andina, Peruvian music, or anything from the Andes. But even this piece, Elegía Andina, the first work, it was my dissertation that got me out of school, was inspired by my initial travel all through my classical music conservatory training. I was watching my friends go off to Paris or Austria to study classical music, and nobody was going to Peru to study classical music, and that's what I was doing. I was self-funding because now we say things like decolonize music history and music theory, but there weren't a lot of human colors. I had to really navigate multiple worlds in that way, deliver what was expected of me and learn the mores of the European tradition, which I actually really love, but recognized it didn't have the same kind of commensurate love back for things I was interested in, so I had to do that on my own. And I thought it would mean that I would not have a substantial career, and the opposite happened, and that's like another talk about, that kind of luck. So I enjoy a substantial international career. I'm really blessed. Looking at a couple of film offers, I've been sort of shying away from that side of the world. It's very hard to cross over. The money's good, so I may try one. And I founded a small but potent nonprofit academy in my name a few years ago, where I train composers now. And it's a mix of Zoom and in person. I don't live in the Bay Area anymore. We have about 25 acres of land, a couple of properties, and we do our music academy there. And it's everything that I think they need to know they're not getting in the conservatory. And that's the beauty of being able to kind of do a nomad. So that's my life.
Amazing. My bio is going to be short. I am Gillian Sneed, Assistant Professor of Art History in the School of Art and Design. I came to SDSU last fall, so this is my second year here. I'm really enjoying being here in San Diego. I completed my PhD in 2019 at the Graduate Center, City University of New York, where I worked on Latin American art of the 20th and 21st centuries. My specific area of specialization is Brazil. My current book project is on Brazilian women artists in the 1970s and 1980s. And my broader research looks at women's contributions to art and issues of gender and sexuality in art across the Americas. So I have some projects with feminist artists in the United States. I'm interested in Latinx art in the United States as well, and Latin American art, women's art more broadly.
Hi, I'm Kristal Bivona, and I'm the Associate Director of the Vayner Steeple Center for Brazilian Studies here on campus. And I'm also a lecturer in the College of Arts and Letters. And I've returned to SDSU because I completed my BA here. I was a transfer student, and when I was a student at SDSU, I lived in Tijuana, so I would cross to come to school and also to work. But I'm originally from Los Angeles. And SDSU for me opened up possibilities and opportunities that I never imagined. When I graduated, I got a Fulbright and went to Buenos Aires. And from Buenos Aires, lived in Brazil for a while, and then did a master's at Dartmouth College in comparative literature, because I was very interested in how different countries remember their dictatorships in starkly different ways. And so after that, I completed my PhD in Spanish and Portuguese at UCLA. And this is from UCLA, I came here. And my dissertation was on transitional justice, which is that legal, juridical, and I would argue also cultural processes of transitioning from dictatorship or conflict to a democracy. And I was looking at how filmmakers from Brazil, Uruguay, and Argentina engage with that in their cinema. And so now my book project is only on Brazil because I'm sure some of you are aware that Brazil's dealing with a really difficult political moment with a far-right president who's dismantled the cultural industry. So it seemed important to focus on Brazil at this moment. But I also work on the Southern Cone, and my first love in literature was actually border literature, and that's in large part to my undergraduate mentor who's here, Emily Hicks, who's professor emeritus here. Yeah. And I'm really excited to be here with you, Gabriela and Gillian.
Thank you.
Well, perhaps we could start our conversation as we pulled the panel together through the last few months. Maybe we could talk just a little bit about women's contributions in your areas in Latin America, just your own experiences or your own expertise, and we could maybe start the conversation there. So maybe we'll start with Gabriela.
Oh, wow. Well, women have been in classical music since the beginning, and it's just not been documented well. And I would even say women of color, and there are a few figures. And I do remember, I came of age in the 90s, talking to our history professors, asking to learn more about women, and they would say, well, women just didn't write worthy of music, and that was it. And they wouldn't even make this effort. And that has changed quite a bit. In part because performers that want to diversify what they're presenting to the public and have, spend their time learning pieces of the piano, that it's not just more Beethoven or more Bach. We're going and finding these pieces. So if you Google Florence Price, this is an amazing story of an African-American woman in the 20s and 30s who was writing symphonies. And you think about what it would take, first of all, to get educated to be able to write for every single dang instrument in the orchestra, much less how to blend them, to know the repertoire. She had certain breaks, lucky breaks in her family. Her parents were more educated. I mean, she came from several generations of just being determined to try and better their lot. And still couldn't, advance very far. There's a really poignant letter where she's writing to a famous conductor and saying, as you can understand, a woman of my background can't get their foot in the door. So she had a couple performances, and then a bunch of her stuff was found abandoned in an old house a few years ago. That's how chancy and lucky this is. So my publishers swooped in and has released all of it, and it's being played everywhere. And the Philadelphia Orchestra picked up a Grammy recording her piano concerto and her symphonies. And it's just endless that the contributions have been here all along. There's some theories that composers like Mendelssohn put his name on some of his sister Fanny, Felix Mendelssohn, Fanny Mendelssohn's compositions. Not because he was trying to co-opt it, but just to get it out there. They were very close. And then you add to that, being a woman of color, or if you're a jazzer coming in, there's just a lot of different compounding difficulties here. There are some movements now within the conservatory training, which is where a lot of these non-21st century mores are consolidated, are starting to be revisited and challenged. Decolonizing music history, decolonizing music theory is a big term. How to get the classical music industry to step into the 21st century, which might mean asking them to play more Latino in a way, or to improvise, or to do all these things that are not part of the vocabulary. I think it's exciting right now, and women and gender has certainly been at the forefront of a lot of this sort of artistic revolution that's happening. I'm seeing a lot of reception. I mean, we got two dudes right here that are like championing my music, and it's just I see young white men that want to study with me at my academy, and so I have a great deal of optimism in spite of all the difficulty, because in the trenches I see all this beautiful art, all this talent is coming out, and social justice that's being put out in music and with a really artful hand, and that's hard to do. It's the best of the artifice with the messaging coming all together. So it's happening. It's slower than I would like, but it's happening.
I can talk a little bit about the histories of women in the visual arts, Latin American women in the visual arts. So if I say, who is a Latin American woman artist, what is everyone going to say? What is the first name that comes to mind? Frida Kahlo, right? And probably that's the only Latin American woman artist that you might be able to think of. The irony with that is that unlike the United States, Latin America, throughout the 20th century and the 21st century, was actually a place where women had a lot of opportunities to become artists in a way that women in the United States perhaps didn't have as much access. So, there's sometimes stereotypes that Latin America has more machismo, so it must be really sexist. And yes, those tropes are also true, but in comparison to the United States, there were more Latin women who were allowed to become artists and had more visibility and acceptance as visual artists. So, Frida was not the only woman artist in Mexico at that time. In the 30s and 40s, there was a woman photographer, Tina Madotti. There was another surrealist or magical realist artist, Maria Izquierdo, who was working at that time, who had as much visibility. In fact, Maria Izquierdo had a show in the United States prior to Frida being recognized. At the time when she was working, when she was alive, she was often just considered to be Diego Rivera's wife. There's a famous newspaper article that described her as I have the quote here, the wife of the master mural painter gleefully dabbles in works of art, and it's her with like a little apron on as like an easel, right? So she's being depicted as a housewife who just has like a side gig in like dabbling in painting. Whereas today, she's considered to be on equal terms with Diego Rivera, right? And she's really, become this icon. Throughout the 1920s, 30s, 40s, 50s, and 60s, Women in Latin America and many places beyond Mexico really thrived. Tarsila do Amaral is a Brazilian modernist who was working at that same period, who's kind of like the equivalent of Frida Kahlo within Brazil. She has great visibility, and she's considered to be the great national artist of Brazil. There was another friend of hers, Anita Malfatti, who actually was the first woman to bring modernism to Latin America. She had studied Expressionism in Germany in the teens and came back to Brazil and had this groundbreaking exhibition where she showed Expressionist art. It was completely panned by the critics because they thought that it was shocking and just outrageous. And then she kind of went into hiding a bit because she responded very negatively to the negative criticism. But then she kind of sparked interest in modernism. And so a woman artist actually brought modernism to Latin America, and then, a few years later, they started making modern art in Brazil. So in many examples, women artists have been at the forefront of, radical new movements in Latin America. There was a wonderful exhibition that happened in 2017 in Los Angeles. It was called PSTLALA. It was a series of exhibitions on Latin American art at many museums and galleries in Los Angeles, and one of them was called Radical Women. And it was the first survey of women Latin American artists from the 1970s and 1980s, and it had 100 artists or more in it to show you how absolutely active women artists were at that period. The thing that's really interesting is that whereas in the United States there was a sort of like organized feminist art movement that happened in the 70s, in Latin America there were women artists working in the 60s and 70s making very similar work that was addressing issues of the body, issues of domestic household duties, issues of the politics of the body, nudity, performance. But many of those women hesitated to label themselves or their art form feminist because they associated feminism with North American imperialism and white feminism. And so and they were oftentimes working within dictatorships and were more focused on resisting the dictatorship with their male colleagues, and they were hesitant to foreground feminist issues above the issues of freedom and liberation and democracy. So it was sort of a taboo thing. Like I'm in my book project that I'm looking at art that I'm reading it through a feminist lens. It's work that deals with the home and with the body and with physical violence to the body, sexuality, eroticism, all the kinds of standard issues that feminist artists in the United States dealt with. But the artists themselves don't call themselves feminists and don't label the work feminist. There were Latin American feminisms. Certainly there were political feminists in Latin America in the 70s and 80s who were developing feminist theory. But in the art world, particularly, it tended to be a little bit taboo until later in Latin America, until the 80s and 90s, when women artists began labeling themselves and their work feminists. And today there's also, lots of broad feminisms. But I think it's important to highlight that the needs of different women's groups, lesbians, women of color, Latin American women, are different. And so sometimes that term feminism isn't like a blanket term, it's something that's more multiple. And it's something that's still being kind of contended with today. But there's so many women artists that were Latin American or Latina, so women of Latin American descent based in the United States. Some other names of some artists that you might have heard of is, of course, Ana Mendieta, who was a Cuban American artist working in the 70s. There's a wonderful podcast about her life and death, currently available by the curator Helen Molesworth, called Death of an Artist. It's a true crime story that explores, did her famous artist husband actually murder her? And the answer to that question is yes. Remedios Navarro was another artist in Mexico. Marisol was a Venezuelan woman artist based in the United States. Chicana artists, obviously in our region, people like Yolanda Lopez and Judy Baca, who Yolanda Lopez was from here in San Diego. So just so many women contributing to a range of art practices that were of Latin American descent, and many who are still very active today.
I think literature, it's a little bit different because Latin American literature for global visibility depends in large part on translation. And in the 20th century, there was what's considered to be a boom of Latin American literature, but the boom was largely male-centered. And many women didn't get global visibility until, there are some possibilities. One possibility would be that feminists in the 70s from France or from the United States took an interest and translated them. So we think of people like Gillian Sneed and Elizabeth Bishop as having a hand in bringing global visibility to some authors, such as Clarice Lispector from the United States. Another possibility was if a man who had a foot in the cultural industry felt or believed in their work and wanted to help them, so to speak. So in that sense, there are authors like Carolina Maria Jesus, who's a Black author from Sao Paulo, who became published for the first time because a newspaper editor took an interest in her work and published it. And so I think because of the apparatus of the publishing industry and of the translation industries and the way that literature circulated before the internet, it was harder for authors from Latin America, women authors from Latin America, to get that global visibility. But today with the internet, of course, it's a totally different ballgame. Even some of those other authors from before are being taken back up. And so we have in English new translations of all of Clarice Lispector's work. We have new translations of Carolina Maria Jesus' work, and more blogs, websites, Instagram accounts, different platforms where people are sharing women's writing from Latin America, both living authors and also the authors from the 20th century. And I think in cinema, women's cinema is also experiencing or receiving more global visibility today, especially with streaming platforms and the internet, because a lot of women have had to grow their careers within the independent cinematic movement, so not having all of the backing of big studios, and also in some ways being overshadowed in some of the revolutionary cinema movements of the 20th century, like Cinema Novo. There were women in Cinema Novo, but they're largely overshadowed. And so today, with the internet and with kind of more sharing of audiovisual content in free ways, there's, I think, more visibility for some of those women. And also for filmmakers who are up and coming that are able to access different ways of producing their work, and being able to have more contact with the international festivals, and that maybe within the industry there's more of an interest in women's work than ever before.
I would add some of the artists in my book project, Brazilian women artists, were not in the official cinema and film world, but they made experimental film and experimental video art as a way to deal with the moving image. I'm thinking of people like Lígia Papi, who was a Brazilian artist in the 70s and 80s, who experimented with film. She actually got her start by doing the title cards for Cinema Novo, like official films, like by male directors. She did the title cards, she designed them. And that kind of got her interested in cinema, but she never really entered the official cinematic realm. She made these experimental sort of underground films as art. So it's interesting, I wonder if it's because as a woman artist, she had more freedom and space to make art, and maybe she couldn't fully enter into the film world. She might not have been interested in sort of making full feature-length films. But oftentimes women artists, at least in Brazil, would experiment with film formats or video formats and maybe not make cinema with a capital C.
I guess I should add, women were definitely writing and definitely making films. Before I was talking more about how those circulated or produced. Many women authors were writing their own literature, but they were being published in newspapers and in magazines, writing columns or doing more journalistic stories. A lot of the most important authors from Latin America who were women had other jobs that paid their bills or where they were able to make money. Like they attended law school or and some of course were from the elite classes and had access to education. And people who could point them towards the right direction for getting their work seen in other places.
Do you know if women had any opportunities to be like public musicians, let's say the 20th century in Latin America? Or was that not really a career option that would have been open? I don't know much about music history in the 20th century.
Yeah, that's an interesting question because they were allowed to be singers. But it was hard to find women that were instrumentalists, much less conductors, leading ensembles. There was too much leadership, Even in Europe, the thing about playing an instrument, like putting a flute to your mouth, was seen as too sexual, or wrapping your legs around a cello, or holding this big bass, instrument. It seemed to like the woman was committing adultery. It was like something big and masculine. But the pianoforte, they didn't have to distort their body like a violin. And so I think some of those mores came through colonization, to be honest. My mom, when she grew up in Peru, she was talking about the one instrument they were allowed to play was in this particular dance called Andean Marcha, which is because Indian women have to carry a lot of things, so this was about throwing these sticks up in the air. And only other women would play instruments, and they'd be singing, and the lyrics would be pretty saucy, and they're banging drums, and even had their hands on charangos, which are like small guitars with the body of an armadillo instrument. So I think it's been a complicated history. Some of the composers at my academy coming in from Latin America talk about it, that our jazzers talk about. It's difficult for them to get ahead. So I think there are a lot of elements to parse out and look at. But my impression is that it was not easy for women to do anything except sing. And even then it was complicated because Latin America did have a history of employing men using falsetto to sing women roles. That wasn't just a European thing. So I don't think they were alive. Yeah.
I would like to maybe ask about, you had brought up streaming. No, you brought up streaming. Yeah, streaming, right? Accessibility to content, how do you feel that's affected our ability to spotlight in your fields? I think about the pandemic, I did a YouTube live performance. I never thought I would have done that until they made me stay indoors for 2 years. Or self-publishing, using a publisher, just how we get content out for performances for the art. How does that affect today versus maybe 100 years ago when somebody was having a hard time writing a letter to a conductor and saying, how do I get this performed? Do we see progress?
I can go first. I think, well, just as a scholar and also as a teacher, I learned so much from YouTube and so much from being able to just Google words to find, and then it leads me to learn about artists that I never knew about. And one example would be a video artist and visual artist from Mexico named Sarah Muther, who made these documentaries about punks in the 80s and with video. And so now I teach her work in my documentary class, but I didn't even know about her before. And she's passed away, and her work is very I realize now it's has a cult following, so occasionally her work gets shown at midnight screenings and in theaters. But I think that even though we can say a lot of critical things about the internet, it's also an incredible tool for learning more about our fields and learning more, especially about women. And now, in my work in the center, I have a film series, and part of the film series is that I interview directors, and a lot of them I can contact through social media, and we keep in touch that way. And people that without that, there's no way I would have been able to contact them in an easy or efficient way.
I agree. I curated a virtual exhibition for the Center. The Center for Brazilian Studies here on campus has a digital humanities project. It's a website that's really exciting. It's called Digital Brazil. Yeah. So check it out.
Digitalbrazilproject.com.
Digitalbrazilproject.com. And one of the spaces on this website is an exhibition space. So normally, if you're going to curate a show, you would do it in a gallery, right, with physical works of art. The beauty of this project is that it really allows the images of artists to be disseminated anywhere in the world, and it gives the opportunity, in this case, to artists from Brazil, who might not have a lot of support or visibility in the United States, to be introduced to audiences here. And so I created an exhibition of sort of emerging Brazilian artists working in collage. And some of these artists, don't have galleries. They're indigenous or artists of color who aren't super established in Brazil even, and like one of the ways I got in touch with them, it was through like Instagram, because they were promoting their work on Instagram. And so I would just like text them on Instagram, hey, would you like to be a part of a virtual exhibition associated with San Diego State? And for them, that's a great opportunity because it gives them more visibility. We interviewed the artists, so they got to talk about their practice, and the interviews are available on the exhibition site. So I think in some ways, going to an art gallery is great, and seeing objects in person is important. But virtual spaces also give other kinds of opportunities for interactivity. In this case, interviews, to be a part of it. In the old days, artists found out about each other or found out about art by either going to art, having access to a museum or an art gallery. Many people in Latin America didn't have access to those kinds of spaces. They would write letters to each other, right? Or they would have art magazines. So they would be getting access to the world or to other artists through like the mail or through the press. Today, just with the click of a finger, you can find out any information you want to about anyone, and you can go down rabbit holes and do research and find out all kinds of information. In my research, I look at a lot of video art and films. I can access most of them online. I do look at them. I do go to archives in Brazil, and I do research in person and hold actual physical papers in my hands. But if I'm writing a description of a film, I don't have to go to like an obscure film house in Sao Paulo to go see it. I can just quickly look at it on YouTube and catch up on like some of the description of what's there or remember some details of it. And that, I think, has just really helped with scholarship on some of these lesser known artists and artists that we're trying to shed more light on.
I would say there's also, in addition to the scholarship, it's amazing, the artists themselves can use the internet for training. And I see that a lot with musicians that are saying, okay, what's the range of a double bass? And can I do a bunch of up bows on a double bass? And then there's like the principal bass player of the Philadelphia Orchestra breaking down how they practice something, and that's really valuable. One of the composers I'm mentoring right now, she is almost 70 years old. She's of Native American ancestry. When she was living on the reservation as a little girl, some famous string quartet, I figured out who it was too, like in the 50s or something, came and played some classical music and it blew her mind, and she never forgot about it, So then she just went on with her life and, doesn't have a lot of money and was working menial jobs, but her kids and her grandkids, I should say, had access to the internet. So they downloaded some software for her, and she was looking at YouTube, and she started writing string quartets. And everything's just in one class, and she reached out and applied to my academy, and I've been mentoring her a little bit, and some of my composers have been working with her. But there's an example of somebody, a woman, a Native American woman, who herself doesn't have internet in her home, but when she visits her grandkids, then she gets internet and is training herself. And then Googled, because my mom is Indigenous as well, I guess she looked up Indigenous people of color with Indigenous ancestry and found me. And actually wrote a note and said she waited a year before she reached out. But so artists themselves, also the creators of these content, when they're not established, to get invited, of finding ways to move themselves to that level too. So I think the internet, for what you were saying, for all its ills, there's been a lot of good things too. It's a complicated kind of arena.
We're so intimate in a group, so if something comes up and you want to ask, please, go. If you don't mind, I'd like to pivot maybe a little bit personally. The piece we're working on with the Wind Symphony is called Free Latin American Dances, so maybe we can talk a little bit about dance in Latin America. And you can talk about the piece, if anything, just even the movements, the three titles.
Yeah. It's just so interesting for me to kind of get this retrospective of my work, because the city of San Diego is going to celebrate this very new, large work. It's my largest work so far. My librettist, one of my best friends, he won a Pulitzer as a playwright, the first Latino to win this prize, that changed his life too. And in Cuba and Peruvian ancestry, we're telling a story that's inspired by Mexican artists, as well as a festival, the Day of the Dead Festival, and what that means about spirituality and love and death. But that's happening now. And then these two earlier works like I said, Elegiandina, the first orchestra work I ever did, so I was in my late 20s, and I was trying to get out of Michigan with my doctorate, and they wouldn't accept the string quartet. So I was like, okay, damn it, you know, I'll write this symphony. And I had just begun traveling in Peru, and so over there, up until a few years ago, I was traveling quite often, and I have a very large family in South America. My mom comes from a family of 15 brothers and sisters. So we had people always to stay with all through Peru, and somebody who didn't grow up bilingual the way I did, I learned to speak Spanish and pretty fluent in it now, and some Indian as a result. So Elegiandina is when I'm just beginning that journey. And then the next orchestra piece I wrote is 3 Latin American dances. And that one was kind of a strategic work. I think the first one was very pure. The second one, I had just signed up with a major publisher agent that changed my life, and they were saying, you really need like a big, boisterous work just to kind of signal some attention. So I wrote this work and learned a lot from it. And I had this, I can't even remember what my original title was. I mean, 3 Latin American Dances is kind of a safe title. It's not like, para quispe, something really indigenous in Spanish. But the titles inside the movements are. And so it has a bit more of a marketing veneer to it. These 2 pieces are among my most frequently played pieces. That's why my publisher was thrilled when this very skilled composer in Tuxicam. I mean, you don't understand. He's being very modest. He's very well known, very established in the field, and said, I want to arrange this for band. And the band world is like busting. They have funding, and they can really blow. These kids that play in the band, all across, especially in Middle America. We were just talking about this where it's at in North Texas, you were saying, but here in the West Coast, we got a lot going on too, like you were describing. So they were thrilled to bring in non-Western indigenous influences into Mid-America band culture. You got to see, if you really look at the big picture, what is streaming where, that we're taking something from the mountains of Bolivia and Peru, and it's being celebrated in the West. And art is such a vehicle for this kind of migration of ideas. Sometimes we don't always look at the roots. And it didn't have to travel over very many generations for that to happen. I'm still an out-of-the-box candidate for having that kind of activity. So, 3 Latin American dances, it kind of travels. The first one's called, it's very influenced by music of the selvas or the jungles. It has a certain kind of rhythm and dance-like quality that you'll see. That kind of alternating with groups of 3, with groups of 2 is something that's very common in the jungles. And there's some hints of some of the percussion rendered through orchestra percussion, which may be built with different kinds of materials, so there's a kind of a different class to what's used. You really have to have membership in multiple cultures to find that overlap, and to try and write something that you hope enlarges the overlap or the discoveries that you're making. The second movement, a lot of people say that's where the heart of it is. It's Highland Atawi, which is Atawi, the melancholy love song. And it's one of the few indigenous forms that we inherited pretty pristine. We kind of know the kinds of pitches that were used, and the affect of it is described in some of the accounts by chroniclers, which from the conquest, you do have to take that with a grain of salt, but it's almost cinematic in its opening, and then it has this big thunderous middle and ends quiet again. And the last one is the most criollo, the most Spanishy sounding of all the styles, and some people say it sounds almost like bullfight music. It's got this opening trumpet fanfare, and it's real short and really lyrical and songful. It's meant to end on a high note. Yeah.
Can you talk a little bit about dance and music in Latin American art? I mean, I think it makes, the connection might be more clear when you're talking about music, right? Because the music is like evoking the dance, right? And dance and music always goes hand in hand. But when modernism was developing in Latin America in the 1920s and 1930s, Latin American artists were interested in adopting some of the stylistic innovations that they saw as very modern, like Cubism coming from Europe, right? But they wanted to make it authentically Latin American. And so one of the ways that they were able to bring in modern styles, but to make it not seem like they were just copying or appropriating those styles, was to try to root these stylistic innovations in terms of just like how the innovations of how the picture looked, like moving towards abstraction, for instance, was to root the imagery itself in sort of folkloric traditions. So you have artists across Latin America who were depicting sort of like folkloric dances or folkloric scenes with folkloric music. Some examples of people like this include Camilo Egas, who is an Ecuadorian painter, who was actually married to a dancer, and who depicts sort of like indigenous Ecuadorians doing traditional ceremonies and dances in a sort of more modern style. Anita Malfatti, who is a Brazilian modernist, the one that I talked about before, who had done the first modern art exhibition in Brazil and was sort of excommunicated or censored because of that. She later in life, towards the end of her career, actually focused on folkloric scenes of sort of popular communities in Brazil, Afro-Brazilian communities, and other kinds of communities, sort of traditional folkloric like dances and other kinds of gatherings. Tarsila do Amaral did the same thing. So it's interesting that those two women artists actually started with a more modern abstract style, and then towards the end of their careers moved to sort of more folkloric scenes and dances and other kinds of gatherings of people. Emilio Petrucci was a sort of Cubist artist in Argentina in the 1920s, who oftentimes depicted like tango bands doing tango music. And so he was depicting these sort of like nightclub tango kind of scenes, but in a Cubist style. Again, trying to root Cubism in something that was more local and specific to the Argentine culture. So I do think that we see like dance and music kind of emerging as a part of depictions of modernism in Latin America in the earlier 20th century. And I don't know about in cinema if there's certainly dance and music are depicted in cinema, right?
Yeah, I mean, I was thinking more about how important dance is for as like a form of soft power as a product that's exported. Mm-hmm. Like everybody, maybe nobody can name a Brazilian filmmaker, but almost everybody can probably imagine a samba dancer because you've seen a samba dancer. Maybe nobody can name an Argentine author, but you can imagine what like tango looks like. And dances travel too, and so even in our elementary school education and high school education, people learn dances from Latin America, even if they don't learn anything else about Latin American culture. So, yeah.
It's a double-edged sword because it can also be rife with stereotype.
Yeah.
If we think about Carmen Miranda, who's probably like the most famous Brazilian film performer, right? She was actually Portuguese. She was a Portuguese European woman who had migrated to Brazil when she was a teen, and then she exported these stereotyped images of exoticism to Hollywood, fitting all these sort of stereotypical desires of the U.S. sort of imaginary of what an exotic Brazilian woman would look like with a bowl of fruit on her head or whatever, dancing around, and really appropriating from Afro-Brazilian culture and making Afro-Brazilian culture more palatable to white Hollywood audiences. And the same thing went for tango. Tango had actually been a form of music that had been sort of whitened and made more sort of like popularized for white bourgeoisie Argentine audiences. So in many cases, sometimes Latin American musical forms and cultures, I don't know if this is something that you've ever come across, were kind of whitewashed for middle class Latin American audiences, more elite and white audiences and audiences of European descent. Race is an issue that has been complicated in Latin America, and there is new discourse out about thinking beyond binaries and to understand the role of race within Latin America. In the United States, we often think of Latin Americans as sort of like a race or an ethnicity, when in fact there are white people in Latin America, there are Afro-Latin American people, there are mixed race people in Latin America, and those conversations are new in Latin America, but very important to have.
Sure. You said that women or someone was exporting photos to show or depict specific women. Can you go?
Carmen Miranda, who I just mentioned.
Yeah.
Yeah. Have you ever heard of her before? So have any of you ever seen a woman with fruit on her head from like Hollywood movies in the 40s? Is that a familiar, Angel, is that a familiar image? That's Carmen Miranda. That's the woman that I was talking about.
Okay.
And so my point is that she was performing stereotypes of exotification. The kind of woman that she was presenting was the woman from Bahia, who was actually an Afro-Brazilian woman. So she's taking Afro-Brazilian dance and music cultures and recreating them as a sort of fiction for Hollywood as a white woman who would make it somehow more palatable. Because at the time in the 1940s, during a period of segregation in the United States, standards of beauty went towards whiteness. And so you couldn't have an Afro-Brazilian woman doing actually real Afro-Brazilian music or real Afro-Brazilian dance. So you have this sort of surrogate Euro-Brazilian woman as a sort of face of exoticism that's palatable to US audiences.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense? Catherine Sanchez just wrote a book about Carmen Miranda. Do you know the title of it? It's a really great topic. I don't know the topic of it either, but her name's Catherine Sanchez, and there's a new book about this very theme. Carmen Miranda is a really interesting figure. If you're curious about her, you could Google her and learn more about her. And she has a very complex background, and there's very complex readings of sort of how she presented Brazilian exoticism to U.S. audiences.
There's also a documentary about her called Bananas is My Business that tells her story.
It's kind of similar to how Josephine Baker, performed sort of exotic African blackness to French audiences, but it was all based on stereotypes. Again, there was this, desire among French audiences for something that was primitive, something that was exotic. So Josephine Baker, an African-American woman who fled the United States where she didn't have many rights or freedoms, came to France and had more opportunities, but she just reperformed a lot of stereotypes about blackness for French audiences because that's what they wanted to see. And in class, we talked about Orientalism, we talked about primitivism, so kind of what I'm talking about is related to some of those conversations that we've had in class about those issues.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm. Good question.
I'm fascinated by the rife with stereotypes even in music. Because as a band director, I hear a lot of composers writing quote-unquote Latin American music that doesn't sound good. And so your piece is refreshing. It's wonderful to hear. It's nailed.
Oh, sure. It's fascinating that Latin American culture or Latin American music was considered exotic like 100 years ago. And then still it's exotic. And so what's the end goal of this inclusion? Is it just a more keeping updated with what's happening in Latin America, or I'm just curious because we're still celebrating Frida, which is great, but what's next for us?
Gabriela, do you want to?
So
Yeah, I have so many things. I just can't do which one am I going to say? I mean, it seems to be so self-evident why I make art that sometimes it's hard to come up with something. And I think I see myself as a cultural witness, that I'm making a documentary of what's going on, and I can tell greater truth through fictionalizing or making unusual revelatory connections. And it's what I tell the composers that I mentor, that just because you don't see your art out there doesn't mean that the world doesn't need to hear your voice. And it can be very confusing to navigate what's trendy, what's in, what's exoticizing, what's cultural appropriation, what's not, who has ownership. And you don't know until you go in there. And I mean, the first stuff that I wrote, that I was incorporating stuff that I heard growing up. And mind you, I grew up in Berkeley. It wasn't like I grew up in Peru. So I grew up on music that was already rendered more palatable. In the 60s, you saw the big explosion of interest in Andean music with the recording industry. So you started seeing, especially in the 70s and 80s, a lot of refugees that were coming out of Latin America. And you started seeing subways, these guys in colorful ponchos and playing the quena flutes and then guitars. And they're going to places like Madrid and Helsinki and Berlin and big major cities. So you, as an artist, you will probably write some stuff that sounds really cheesy because you're trying to get skilled and you have to almost peel off the layers of everything you've been saturated in. So you may put maracas and everything, and maracas are not even of the culture, or you may use instruments that are available to you. And if you're skilled, you can make those maracas sound like they're from any culture. That's what I tell my composers. Like if I give you the ingredients for a burrito, can you make Japanese food from it? Do you have the skill set to make that marimba bend in any way that you need it to bend? And yes, strip it of cultural associations, and then organically bring back to life what you want. So I think where we are going is an extension of that kind of exploration. But it does mean seeing yourself as a cultural witness and reading history and being up in politics. I do have composers that have great technical skill sets, and I don't invite them to my academy because I don't think they're very interesting, and that they wouldn't provide fodder for a discussion like this. But they can play everything in tune, and they can, orchestrate really well. But I think you really need to have somebody with that cultural witness mindset.
I mean, the question of what is next, I think it's a hard question because I think there are cultural witnesses, but then there are also people that take advantage of positions of power to appropriate, and so it like both things happen, and unfortunately, and I think that neoliberalism makes this even worse, but Latin America has historically had a neo-colonial relationship after independence with Europe and the United States, to the point where artists need the international validation sometimes in order to even be recognized as legitimate at home.
That's a huge problem.
Yeah.
That's a really big problem, and something that you'll see. I have friends that, for example, play in the Silkwood ensemble, and I've worked with them, and what we've been trying to dialogue with them is that because, especially when Yo-Yo Ma, one of the kind of the problematic of string instruments, came in, and they went to some impoverished country that was exotic to the West, and they find the first oud player and say, this style is like, amazing. Everybody else drops what they were learning. All the other more delicate sub-music cultures start writing. And it's just like a big giant step that comes in because that one oud player can suddenly provide for their family. It's something very basic. And they themselves will elect to not uphold maybe even their accurate culture that they actually come from. I didn't mean to jump in, but it's just like I just have to kind of like it because it's something that you really do have to be careful about when it's commercial, when there's money behind it, and the money, when people are desperate. And I've seen people take on gigs that they were ashamed to take, to propagate a stereotype or propagate that dominant view of their culture because they're desperate, desperate for exposure, desperate to pay bills.
And then on the other hand, you might have somebody who's more contemporary, like Manu Chao, who traveled all over Latin America, but is a European and incorporated a lot of the sounds that he heard in his travels into his music. And a lot of people outside of Latin America would recognize his music as like a kind of Latin American music or the Latin American sounds, while a lot of people in Latin America think of him as like an appropriator. Mm-hmm. So it's very,
Yeah, and this term of world music, I kind of get an allergic reaction. It messes me up. It's just very problematic. It really, really is problematic.
Yeah, same with world literature. Or global cinema.
Was there a question up here?
Yeah.
I saw your hand.
Where does that line get drawn between cultural appropriation and trying to
Great question.
honor and respect those traditions? Because it's kind of interesting, playing the Latin American dances right now. Like, I'm white as hell. Like, I have no idea how to do this, and infuse that life and that soul that
Great
music
question.
so clearly comes from, without also feeling like it's slightly culturally appropriating. It's almost like a Halloween costume, that I don't want to put on.
Yeah, it's a great question. There are no easy answers, and I think the proof's in the pudding. You have to kind of go in. You might get clumsy, just apologize, and try again. But I mean, culture is not supposed to be a border, it's supposed to be a portal. It's supposed to go through. And we're supposed to share this with one another. And the whole, with dignity, with respect, and with curiosity, and with joy. I mean, you pick a Mexican restaurant you go to, but it's like, Oaxaca, and people really get passionate about it. I love that kind of energy. And I love fusion, but I rub up against that all the time in my own work, and I'm supposedly of more membership than somebody like you, but still not sufficiently of membership by some people's standards. So, even with this opera that's coming out, the fact that I'm not Mexican and my writer's not Mexican, that's going into a deeply Mexican territory, we have to be very careful. We have to answer questions that were very pointed from Mexican reporters. And my hope is that this opera would be seen as a gift. I mean, I just love these two figures so much after being in their story for so long. And I worked my ass off, and I have already designated a certain percentage of my royalty to go into certain fund for Mexican composers and musicians. And, I mean, there are different things that you can do like that. And try not to be tacky. It's pretty tacky when you just kind of rape a culture and then make money off of it, and you take the most obvious salient elements about it. You haven't done your homework. But you need to take a step and try and figure. I had to apologize to somebody a few days ago because I misgendered them. I felt so Gen X that I misgendered them, and I apologize. But you got to go. The worst thing we can do is handle everything with kidless. You've got to just try and embrace this condition of being human, which is, we're diverse, you're diverse, and we're trying to connect.
Yeah, I second that. I think it's not about that if you're in one cultural category, you can't have anything to do with another cultural category. It's about respect, learning the context, really studying that culture, being open to feedback from those who are members of that culture, being self-aware and humble and enthusiastic, and bringing great passion and joy and love of that. The reason you're interested is because you're so passionate and interested in this cultural form, right? So I think it's all about how you treat the cultural form, how much self-awareness you have when you're engaging with that cultural form that's not your own. The culture is there to be enjoyed by everyone. That's why people, create cultural forms. Art and music and dance and cinema are things that creators make for us to engage with. So it would be really sad if we didn't engage with the cultural forms of other cultures. It's just that we need, when we're engaging with them, we need to do so with a great deal of respect and humility. And also, letting people know how excited you are by these cultural forms, I think, is another way of showing respect.
I've got audience members that come out there, white as white can be, or Chinese can be, or whatever, and come up and they're excited and they say, I did the Inca Trail, and my heart goes, oh, I love you. You're really trying to connect. They, I don't feel demeaned that they come up with something very touristic and all of that, but I have the luxury of not feeling exploited. And there's some artists that might feel a little raw with the same kind of sort of naive or a little bit clumsy of a reaction. You just gotta go, and I think most artists that have been doing this for a long time, who are financially stable and can be very generous and compassionate, and I talk with them. I said, oh man, you're more proving than I am. I didn't go to the Inca Trail yet, so you can try and keep that hospitality, going.
Yeah, I was just gonna, add one thing, and that is giving credit to that other culture. A lot of times when the argument or clamor on cultural appropriation comes up, it's as a result of you, the visitor or the experiencer of that culture, not giving due credit to the home culture or your object of study, which is that culture. And that's usually what breeds contention. So yeah, that's just my own addition.
Or the name of the artist. right?
Yeah.
For example, in art exhibitions, this is an art exhibition I've been talking about in some of my classes, it's called Primitivism that happened in 1984 at the Museum of Modern Art. And guess what the white male curators of the exhibition did? They gave name titles and tags to all the white European artists, and they just put the African art up with no tags that said the culture it came from or the names of the people who made it. So it was completely depersonalized and completely appropriated, right? So attribution of who created something is really important.
Why was that?
That was Primitivism in 1984. Museum of Modern Art.
Why did they not?
It was about affinities it was called, I think the subtitle was Formal Affinities in Art, and it was about how European modernists shared similar formal affinities with tribal art from non-Western cultures. And I think that the curators wanted the audiences to focus on the formal qualities of the tribal art. And they didn't want it to be an ethnological or ethnographic exhibition. They were trying to distinguish it. In their minds, they were kind of elevating this to art because it had previously been seen as anthropological objects. And they felt that it wasn't necessary to situate or contextualize the art objects from non-Western cultures. It was Oceania, it was African, tribal art, etc. That was their argumentation, but it was super problematic and it was very critiqued at the time.
Do we have any other questions from anybody in our audience? For our panel?
I mean, I think one of the things we've talked about in rehearsal, we spent a good deal of time talking about it, not just working on the music, but like actually talking. So like, for example, like the waltz, it's like a very nice like marriage of different cultural styles. It's not just Latin music or it's a waltz or this or that. It's this like combination of elements that I think everyone can appreciate, even if they're not entirely familiar with the source material or the source inspiration. And like Dr. Kitelinger said, there are plenty of pieces that have the word Latin in the title, or there may be the titles in Spanish or some other Latin language, but the music is not. It's very clearly like kind of like a rip-off. It's very vaguely Latin American. It's very vaguely whatever culture it is borrowing from. Just because you have a flat second scale there doesn't mean that your music is Arabic. But
So lazy.
There's plenty of
So
music
lazy,
that's written
yeah.
like that, right? And so I guess like the importance of like I said, that marriage, like mestizo waltz. We spent time talking about the word mestizo itself, just like talking about it and what it means. And people were chiming in from different places. We even had someone in our ensemble who was Filipino.
I wish that's what I hope my music does.
Yeah.
That's why I do this. The accolades are great, you know, it's awesome, but to be able to invite your interpretation of the music and what it means to you, so it's not even my music anymore. You know, yeah, my name's on it, but it's like the way you guys put it out there and what it means to you is the biggest compliment you can give to a writer or to a composer. So, thank you for that. It's amazing. What do you play?
I play saxophone, so
Okay.
not something you originally wrote for. And that's another layer too, is that we're not just playing your interpretation of it, it's your interpretation through Dr. Kim's arrangement.
Yeah.
And so there are things, it's not just we're playing this piece and you play the right notes on the page and it's going to sound right. We have to embody the timbre and the style of the way an orchestra would play it. And especially as a saxophone where that's not an instrument.
But the funny thing is that there's so many layers of this because saxophone is actually really big in a few central highland towns in Peru. So when I was writing this music, I was sort of thinking about those saxophone players trying to sound like panpipes, trying to sound like a European instrument. So this thing, I mean, Bartos did this a lot, where you talk about, you know, a tune that originated in Romania that goes over to Moldavia. When it comes back to Romania, it doesn't revert back, it takes another layer. And so when we call something Mexican, you know, like, well, at what point in its history are we freezing it and saying this is Mexican? There have been so many strands that have been coming in, indigenous, colonial. So you're actually more authentic than you may know, just because of how complex and multi-layered these histories are. Ultimately, you know, the funnel that is coming through now, which is YouTube. Are you in it also? Yeah, what do you do?
I'm playing bass on this one.
You play what?
Bass cornet.
Oh, that's like one of my favorite instruments too.
I can tell.
That kind of low tone.
Yeah.
You see in every culture in the world.
Yeah.
You can just pivot it and suddenly you're in Africa, you know, like East Africa, or you're in Tibet. It's just, I mean, these are just colors. We're painting with the sound, and it evokes all of these histories. I forgot what I was going to say, but I know it was really good. So.
There's a question over here.
Yeah, well, I kind of wanted to delve into this a little bit more and actually hear your thoughts about it, because the conversation's been really fascinating so far. And what you started digging into right now, I'm curious about. We've sort of moved into a territory we've been talking a lot about cultural appropriation and about these different sort of cultural categories. At the beginning of our discussion, we talked a lot about gender and being an artist as a woman. And so I guess this question is kind of two parts. Like, what do you think makes music, like, can music be Latin? What makes music sound Latin? So what I mean by that is, like, your string quartet that they wouldn't accept. Is that string quartet Latin? Does it need maracas to be Latin? You know, like, these kinds of questions about, like, what makes the music sound that way. We talk about this a lot in an intro to music course that I talk about. Like, why does this music sound American? Why does this music sound French? And then the second part of the question would be, can music sound feminist? Like, is your music feminist? Can it sound that way? Can anybody write feminist music? Or is it, I don't imagine that you have a perfect answer to this. It's such a difficult question, but is it about intent behind the music or identity of the person, of the artist? Or is there something in the work that you hear?
You know, I get asked a lot. It's still a question that female composers get asked. So, do you want to be called a woman composer or just a composer? I've gone through all the permutations over my life, you know, and so I kind of say, well, today, you know, I have to tell you, I'm a woman 24 hours a day, 7 days a week. I'm always a woman composer. It's kind of self-evident, you know. Same with, are you, Latinx or a Latina composer or not? And I kind of shifted with the context. So if I take a gig in, say, the South, where classical music may not have, especially contemporary classical music, may not have the legs that it does in New York City. I mean, who cares about a concert of women composers in New York City? It's not going to attract people. It's not going to cause discussion. But it might in Alabama. And so then I will highlight it, because I do feel that I'm an activist. If I'm a cultural witness and I've embraced that mantle, I'm automatically an activist. That's just what it is. And there's a reason why art has been so often squashed whenever there are more authoritarian impulses in a country, in a government. One of the first things they do is squash the artistic voice. So when I talk with my peers, there's a kind of general agreement that it's really hard to write music that is gender identifiable. And that if you're kind of, you can do Latin sounds cheap, and then it's harder to do it in a more in-depth way where you're getting into the DNA of it, and it's just like the soul of it comes out. There's no algorithm. I don't think AI-generated music will ever get to this level. I think it will always stay at the surface and do the maracas thing. But it's just, and there are gradations of it. So if you listen to my music, 3 Latin American dances is a little more vibrant and evident, but doesn't take the most obvious salient elements. And I run it through the blender of my imagination. It's almost like a what if Latin America. Like, what would this sound like? I think it's harder to imagine the future in 30 years than it is in 200 years. It can get really fantastical. You know, we're flying by then, or we're cyborg, or whatever, you know, because of the climate. But to imagine 20, 30 years is a lot harder, because it has to be revelatory new, but still have identifiable roots. So I try and emulate for that often, you know, to stretch. And that you look at somebody like Bartók. So Béla Bartók was born in 1881 and died in 1945. And his great passion was Eastern European music. You see him go through a difficult journey with his views on gypsies that he thought was not doing a pure folkloric music, that he thought this was charlatan music. And then he came to an understanding about how they were persecuted. They were giving, we have an expression, you know, all over Latin America, like basically give the gringos what they want, you know, just to get the money and the payment. Well, the gypsies were doing that to survive too. And then when he gained their trust and they're opening up his, more into culture. So he has this great range. And his most sophisticated music is where he's taking like the DNA and almost writing new Eastern European music and taking the elements that you could see it evolving towards. But that's in Bartok land, and I think that's quite wonderful. So I emulate to do that. I think the general consensus is gender is impossible to accurately represent. I mean, putting melodies is not necessarily in the purview of just women, and a strong percussion section is not just in the purview of men. But at a surface level, yeah, you can grab onto maracas and call that Latin American inspired if you like, but it will just disappear in the sands of time. It won't last. There's just this cruddy stuff just blows off.
In the same way that you've been talking about Bartok and the folkloric influences, could you just address Benjamin Britten's music and Britten's music?
Whose music?
Britten's music.
Benjamin Britten?
Yes.
Yeah.
And in the same way that you just talked about Bartok.
Benjamin is an interesting case, and he's a composer. I don't know. I mean, I know his stuff well, but I don't know it as well as I do Bartok, who was a personal hero to me. I played everything I could of Bartok. Benjamin was more commercial right off the bat, and so that informed his choices. And he was more in the opera world. So Bartok only has one opera, Rivere's Council, which doesn't really have any really discernible DNA in Eastern European forms. It's kind of it. But Benjamin really was interested in theater and story, and opera has to sell. There has always been much more pressure on opera than on the forms that Bartok was writing for. And he's known for string quartets. It's not dependent on getting seats in the table, not dependent on marketing. So Benjamin was more interested in the traditional choral history of England that had its own mix of Protestant, Lutheran. I mean, it's a complicated kind of a spirituality that's there. If you look at how he writes for the choir, it's very didactic. You shall not cross. It's not like it's not melismatic, which is a little bit more Italian. And he wasn't really into that. Wildly inventive. He came up with new ways of getting the voice out there. I mean, I consider him one of my remote teachers, because I studied his opera in preparation for this one about why it's so theatrical and effective. In my opinion, he did not go to the depth of somebody like Bartok, who they speculate was autistic in terms of translating 20, 30,000 folkloric native tunes, and he was his own almost AI generator in that way, finding the patterns of writing essays. He was one of our first great ethnomusicologists. Benjamin was not at that level. He was very much in the theater, yet he was very proud of the British and the gay man. He was one of the first to talk about being gay. And there are gay themes, relationship between older men and younger men that he explores in his opera too. And he was very much of the spoken word. He knew British poets. His War Requiem was about 1915. I'm forgetting the name of the poet. Wasn't it Wilson Owens? Just ringing a bell. He took the Latin. It's very daring. He took Latin liturgical texts that was used by Mozart, Brahms, Fauré, but then welded it to the text of a living poet, and it was against war. So he took the wars of his time to produce his work. He's different. He's very different from Bartok.
It just seems that we didn't really bring all that up, but we are kind of talking about how to take strands, elements, tentacles. Yeah.
And to me, those are just techniques. They're just tools for me to witness. And it's very easy as an artist to get caught up in all of that and not think about the larger question of dance, history, gender, cultural appropriation. And I think Bartok and Benjamin did, but in their own way, as fitting their era and their personal goals.